Israeli opposition parties have reached an agreement to form a new government and oust Benjamin Netanyahu, the country's longest-serving prime minister. The new coalition is an unusual alliance of 8 political parties with diverse ideologies, from the left to the far right. Natasha Hussain reports.
With minutes to go before a midnight deadline on Wednesday, Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid called President Reuven Rivlin with some urgent news.
Mr. President, I'm calling you to say that I have succeeded in forming a government with all the factions. All of them together, they signed for me. So I'm calling to inform you that I have succeeded in forming a government.
Lapid worked as a reporter, editor, and TV presenter before entering politics in 2012. He formed his own party, Yesh Atid, which means there is a future. The party portrays itself as centrist and represents Israel's secular middle class. In the 2013 elections, it won the second largest number of seats in the Knesset. Yesh Atid joined Netanyahu's coalition government that year, and Lapid became finance minister. But he broke with the prime minister and in the 2019 elections joined the centrist blue and white coalition. That alliance also ended when its leader Benny Gantz agreed to form a coalition with Netanyahu. Lapid's main partner is nationalist Naftali Bennett. He was born to American parents and grew up in Haifa. A multimillionaire and former software entrepreneur, Bennett entered politics after selling his tech startup for $145 million in 2005. He became Netanyahu's chief of staff a year later and was part of the coalition government until it collapsed in 2018. In December that year, Bennett formed his own right-wing party. He was widely regarded as Netanyahu's protege, but could now play a starring role in ousting the prime minister. Bennett strongly opposes a Palestinian state and backs Israel's proposed annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank. For the first time in Israel's history, the coalition government will include a party that represents a minority, the United Arab List.
There are many things in this agreement that benefit Arab society as well as Israeli society as a whole, mainly in the Negev area, in the country's south that's stricken with many problems, like the regularization of the unrecognized villages.
Hundreds of people have taken to the streets to celebrate news of a government that would end Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year tenure as prime minister.
We're celebrating formation of new government. For 2 years, Israel hasn't had any government. We have had several elections that were endless, and now we are hopeful for a new stable government.
We managed to topple this tyrannical, unlawful government. We hope for the best. Nothing is certain, but the will of the people will prevail.
The new government, which commands a razor-thin majority in parliament, is only expected to be sworn in about 10 days' time, leaving room for Netanyahu to try to lure lawmakers over to his side. Natasha Hussain, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on this now from Keren Uziyel in London. She's a senior analyst and country risk manager at the Economist Intelligence Unit's Middle East and Africa team. She joins us in London. Thank you so much for joining us on the program, Keren. Firstly, this coalition of 8 parties from across Israel's political spectrum really is unwieldy. It includes an unlikely partnership with the right-wing Yamina party headed by Naftali Bennett, as we heard there, who doesn't believe in the concept of a Palestinian state. It also includes centrist and left-wing parties, as well as an Arab-Israeli party for the first time. If the Knesset does sign off on this coalition, do you think it'll survive? Will it be able to effectively govern, given their diverse and competing interests?
Yes, you're right. This is truly a wide government. Israeli governments always rule in coalition, so that in itself is not unusual, but 8 parties is unprecedented. In addition, we have an Arab party that will not have cabinet seats, but is part of the government coalition agreement for the first time. And it will be truly unwieldy. They will try and stick to policy areas where there's more room for consensus, possibly on some fiscal consolidation, infrastructure and construction development. and to a certain extent policy on Iran in terms of foreign relations. But there'll be so much that divides them, and that's not just the Palestine issue, and it's not just economic issues, but going down to civil law, judicial appointments. Um, it, it will be rife for an early collapse, and that's if it gets approved and actually takes office.
That's right. I would want to ask you about that because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is already galvanizing his allies in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. He's calling on right-wing members to vote it down when they're expected to meet sometime this week or the next. Is that a real possibility that perhaps this coalition won't get sworn in at all?
It's a very real possibility. Mr. Netanyahu is the ultimate political survivor. He's uh, pushed through to lead government from positions similar to this in the past. We have, so under the coalition agreement, Mr. Lapid will actually concede to Mr. Bennett as Prime Minister first, even though he leads a much smaller party. And within that party, there are two of the seven MPs that Mr. Bennett controls have already shown reluctance to vote for the coalition, for their government. So, and that takes the government to below a majority. So they would then have to rely on outside help, possibly from some of the other Arab parties, but they haven't confirmed whether they will do so. The new change bloc is trying to unseat the Speaker of the Parliament, who's trying to delay the vote. They have until mid-June, basically, to approve the government, and there's all kinds of manoeuvring to try and accelerate that, because Mr. Lapid and Mr. Bennett are aware that the longer this lasts, the more chance Mr. Netanyahu has of manoeuvring himself back into a viable position or into a fifth election. So.
Can I ask you quickly about Israel's economy now? In 2020, it suffered a relatively minor contraction and it's expected to expand between 5 and 7% this year on the heels of a largely successful vaccine rollout. Can you tell us more about the state of the Israeli economy and what any new government needs to prioritize?
The Israeli economy has proved very resilient over the last more than decades. So it's not just the coronavirus pandemic, but the global financial crisis. That's a lot to do with economic reforms that took place over the past decades, including under Netanyahu's earlier tenure. And the sectors that are the most important in terms of driving economic growth in Israel include the high technology goods and services. And these were relatively resilient globally in the global pandemic and have driven economic growth and the economic recovery, coupled with a very rapid, the most rapid vaccine rollout of any country in the world. So that means that the economy's opened up and the economic prospects are really good. There are some underlying serious economic issues, productivity, the lack of engagement in the labor force of sections of the community. That includes the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, but also elements of the Arab population as well. So these are areas where I think there will be some consensus in the government around that, because we don't have any ultra-Orthodox parties serving. Mr. Bennett is religious, but not from that background. So there won't be internal pressure. And I think that will be an area of focus. The other area is to look at fiscal consolidation. And Mr. Lapid served as finance minister under Mr. Netanyahu, and I think he will drive towards consolidating the fiscal finances. Israel registered a fiscal deficit of almost 12% of GDP last year, and government revenues are increasing really rapidly, but they'll also need to cut back on spending.
Okay, Keren Uziyel from the Economist Intelligence Unit, thank you so much for giving us your analysis on the program.